They called his proposal misguided. That was their first mistake. The second was thinking the flimsy violation notices they mailed to his house could bury a man who built things for a living. The community room smelled of stale coffee and quiet prejudice. It was a beige, soulless space, filled with the kind of people who believed rules were more important than reason. At the front, behind a folding table, sat Mr. Henderson, president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. He was a man in his 60s with a soft paunch, a pink polo shirt, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He held power here. Not the kind that built cities or inspired nations, but the small, petty kind that thrived in the fertile soil of bylaws and neighborhood covenants. Marcus Thorne stood before him. He was not a protester. He was an architect, a man who spoke the language of blueprints and load-bearing walls. His hands, broad and calloused from years of gripping drafting pencils and walking construction sites, rested on the cheap wooden lectern. In front of him was a folder, neatly organized. Inside were 3 bids from 3 different highly rated black-owned contracting firms to repair the cracked and buckled sidewalks that snaked through their subdivision. Each bid was nearly 30% cheaper than the one submitted by Henderson's guy, a white contractor with a new truck and a spotty record. "As you can see," Marcus said, his voice calm and even, a low baritone that commanded attention without needing to be raised. "These are not just competitive bids. They offer superior materials and a longer warranty. It's fiscally responsible. It's better for the community." He looked around the room. A few heads nodded. Most looked down, studying the scuffs on their shoes, suddenly fascinated by the texture of the carpet. They were good people, mostly. The kind who brought you cookies when you moved in and waved when you drove by. But they were also the kind who valued peace over justice, comfort over confrontation. Henderson cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. A very passionate presentation." He picked up the folder with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated and placed it aside without opening it. "However, we have a process for these things. The board has already vetted a vendor we trust, one who understands the quality we expect at Oak Creek. Perhaps you're not familiar with how we handle these matters here." The insult was subtle, wrapped in the soft cotton of procedure, but it landed with the force of a shove. "You are not from here. You do not belong. You do not understand." Marcus felt the heat rise in his neck, but his expression remained a mask of placid control. He had lived in America for 38 years. He knew what that sentence meant. It was the same sentence that lived in the lingering gaze of a police officer, the locked door of a country club, the polite rejection from a bank. He simply nodded. "I see." He walked back to his seat beside his wife, Maya. She reached for his hand under the table, her fingers lacing through his. Her touch was an anchor in the silent, swirling storm of the room. The board voted. Unanimously. Henderson's guy got the contract. The cracks in the sidewalk would be patched with overpriced concrete and quiet complicity. As Marcus and Maya left the clubhouse, the streetlights cast long shadows that looked like fractures on the ground. He didn't know it then, but the war had just begun. The first violation notice was a skirmish, a warning shot. It arrived 3 days later. A crisp white envelope with the HOA logo. The citation was for leaving their garbage bins at the curb for more than 12 hours after pickup. A $25 fine. Marcus had been home with the flu. Maya had been juggling work and taking care of him and their 8-year-old son, Leo. They'd forgotten. It was a simple human error. "Don't worry about it," Maya said, her voice tight as she tossed the notice on the kitchen counter. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was a message. A week later, another one came. This time for Leo's bicycle, left near the mailbox for a few hours after school. $50. The notice included a grainy photograph taken from a car like evidence in a criminal case. The angle felt invasive, predatory. "Who does this?" Maya whispered, staring at the picture of her son's red bike. "Who walks around taking pictures of a child's toy?" Marcus didn't answer. He just stared at the notice, at the clean, printed letters that felt more like a threat than a reminder. He saw Henderson's smiling, empty eyes. Then they started coming like rain. A notice for the grass being a quarter-inch too high along the driveway. $100. A notice for a visible garden hose, coiled neatly by the side of the house, but not entirely hidden by the bushes. $75. A notice for an unapproved decorative planter on their porch, a ceramic pot Maya had bought at a local market. $150 and a demand for its immediate removal. Each notice was a paper cut, small, stinging, and meant to bleed them slowly. Their savings account, the one they were building for Leo's future, for a vacation they hadn't taken in years, began to shrink. The stress settled into their home like a fine dust, coating everything. Maya grew quiet, her smile strained. Leo felt it too. "Dad, did we get another bad note?" he asked one evening, seeing the familiar white envelope in his father's hand. Marcus's heart cracked. A bad note. That's what his son called it. A judgment. A punishment for existing in a space that was supposed to be theirs. He knelt, his big hands resting on his son's small shoulders. "It's not a bad note, buddy. It's just paper. It means nothing." But he was lying. It meant everything. It was a calculated campaign of harassment designed to make them feel unwelcome, to wear them down until they either submitted or left. That night, after Maya and Leo were asleep, Marcus sat at the dining room table, the pile of violations spread before him like a tarot reading of his family's future. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. The street outside was dark. He looked at his hands. These were the hands of a builder. Hands that drew lines, that measured angles, that understood how to create a foundation that could withstand a storm. He had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds and bridges that spanned rivers. He had always believed that if you built something sound with logic and integrity, it would stand. But this wasn't about logic. It was about power. He closed his eyes. He saw Henderson's face, heard his condescending tone. "Perhaps you're not familiar with how we handle things here." A cold, quiet anger settled deep in his gut. It wasn't the hot, explosive kind, but a slow, burning fire, an architect's fury. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't break. He would dismantle. He would take Henderson's meticulously crafted rulebook and use it as a blueprint for his destruction. He stood up and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down the thick, 3-ring binder that contained the Oak Creek HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. He opened it to the first page. The fluorescent light of the kitchen gleamed off the text. The fight for his home, for his family's peace, had begun. Not with a shout, but with the silent turning of a page. Marcus Thorne became a scholar of his own oppression. Every night, after the house settled into a quiet rhythm of sleep, he sat at the dining room table with the HOA binder, a highlighter, and a legal pad. He read every line, every sub-clause, every amendment. He memorized the tedious language of lawn maintenance, fence heights, and exterior paint finishes. He wasn't just reading the rules. He was learning the weapon that was being used against him. Maya would find him there in the mornings, asleep with his head on the open book, the faint scent of coffee and defiance in the air. At first she was worried. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the new lines of stress around his mouth. "Marcus, maybe we should just pay the fines," she'd said one night, her voice heavy with fatigue. "Maybe we should just paint the planter. It's not worth this." "It's not about the planter, Maya," he'd replied, his voice low but firm. "It's about the reason they're citing it. If we give in on this, what's next? They're trying to tax us for breathing. I'm not paying that tax." His first small victory came a few weeks later. A certified letter arrived, summoning him to a hearing for one of their most absurd violations: improperly stored recreational equipment. Leo's basketball hoop. It was in their backyard, invisible from the street, but a neighbor's complaint, anonymous of course, had been filed. Marcus walked into the hearing, held in the same soulless community room, feeling the familiar weight of Henderson's condescending gaze. But this time, Marcus wasn't just a homeowner. He was an expert. Henderson began, reading the complaint in a monotone. The complaint states that a portable basketball hoop is being stored in the backyard, which is in violation of Article Roman 4, Section 3b, which prohibits. "Respectfully, Mr. Henderson," Marcus interrupted, his voice calm and precise. "Article Roman 4, Section 3b pertains to structures erected on common property or visible from the front elevation of the home. As my property backs onto a wooded preserve and is not visible from any street or common area, that article does not apply." Henderson blinked, momentarily thrown. Well, the spirit of the rule is to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. "The spirit of the rule isn't what's written in the bylaws," Marcus countered, opening his own copy of the binder to the tabbed page. "Furthermore, if you'll turn to Article VI, Section 8c, regarding nuisances, you'll note that for a backyard item to be considered a nuisance, it must be audible or visible from an adjacent neighbor's primary living space. I have a signed affidavit from my direct neighbor, Mr. Chen, stating he cannot see or hear the hoop from his home." He slid the signed paper across the table. A thick silence filled the room. The other board members looked from Marcus to Henderson, their expressions a mixture of surprise and discomfort. Henderson's face flushed a faint shade of pink. He had been so used to people cowering, apologizing, writing the check. He wasn't prepared for someone who had done their homework. "The fine is dismissed," Henderson muttered, his voice tight. It was a tiny win, a $100 fine waived. But as Marcus walked out of that room, he felt a foot taller. He hadn't just won an argument. He had drawn first blood using their own sword. That victory gave him the fuel to look for allies. He started taking walks in the evenings, not just for exercise, but for reconnaissance. He noticed things. The same white contractor trucks parked in front of the homes of board members, doing work that seemed to push the boundaries of the very rules they enforced. He saw Henderson's own fence, a wrought iron monstrosity that was at least a foot taller than the 6-foot limit specified in the bylaws. He took a picture, quietly. One Saturday morning, he saw an older white woman, Mrs. Gable, struggling with a city citation for her overgrown rose bushes. She was a widow who had lived in Oak Creek since it was first built. "HOA got you too?" Marcus asked, offering a gentle smile. Mrs. Gable sighed, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. It's Henderson. He's been after me for years, ever since I voted against his proposal to cut down the old oaks by the entrance. Now, every time a petal falls on the sidewalk, I get a letter. Marcus listened. He heard the same story of petty tyranny, of rules weaponized for personal vendettas. He seems to have a problem with anyone who doesn't fall in line, Marcus said carefully. Mrs. Gable's eyes, sharp and intelligent, studied him. He has a problem with anyone who isn't him, dear. You for questioning his sacred contract, me for liking trees. The Chens for having a garden he finds exotic. He bullies who he thinks he can. She paused, lowering her voice. But he's sloppy. He thinks he's so clever, but he leaves a trail, that contractor of his. The one he hired to fix the sidewalks, that's his brother-in-law. The air stilled. Marcus felt a jolt like a low-voltage current running up his spine. Are you sure? I've been to his family barbecues, dear, she said with a wry smile. I've seen them carve a turkey together. The company, Precision Paving, was registered just 6 months ago. Before that, Frank, that's the brother-in-law, was laying tile for bathrooms. There it was. Not just prejudice, not just bullying, corruption. A clear-cut conflict of interest. He's not just cracking down on us, Marcus said, the pieces clicking into place. He's trying to silence anyone who might look too closely at his books. That evening, Marcus didn't just sit with the bylaws. He sat with a list of names. The Chens, the Garcias, who'd been fined for their son's graduation party making too much noise. The young gay couple who were cited for their rainbow flag during Pride Month, cited as an unapproved sign. He started making phone calls. He started knocking on doors. He didn't come with anger. He came with facts. He came with his own story, and he asked to hear theirs. Slowly, cautiously, a coalition began to form. A quiet rebellion brewing in the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes of Oak Creek. They met in living rooms over coffee, whispering about fines and injustices. They were black, white, Asian, Hispanic, old, young. They were a cross-section of the community Henderson had tried to control, and they were tired of being afraid. Marcus, the quiet architect, had become the reluctant general of a suburban revolution. He had started by fighting for his family, but now he was fighting for them all. The final HOA meeting was scheduled for the end of the month. Henderson had no idea he wasn't just facing Marcus Thorne anymore. He was facing an army. The community room was electric. Every seat was filled with people standing along the back wall, their arms crossed, their faces a mixture of anxiety and resolve. This wasn't the usual sparsely attended HOA meeting. This was a reckoning. At the front, Henderson and his board sat behind their folding table, looking out at the crowd with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Henderson, in his signature pink polo, tapped the microphone. "All right, let's get started. We have a lot to get through tonight." He tried for his usual tone of board authority, but a slight tremor in his hand betrayed his unease. The meeting dragged on with mundane business. Pool IORs, landscaping updates. Marcus sat patiently beside Maya, his hands resting on a thick manila folder in his lap. He could feel the collective gaze of his allies, the silent network of neighbors he had spent weeks organizing. They were all waiting for their moment. Finally, Henderson sighed. "That concludes the scheduled agenda. Is there any new business?" This was the signal. Marcus stood up. A hush fell over the room. "Mr. Thorne," Henderson said, his voice dripping with condescension. "If this is another debate about the sidewalk contract, that matter is closed." "This isn't about the contract, Mr. Henderson," Marcus said, his voice resonating through the room, calm and clear. "This is about you." He walked to the lectern and opened his folder. "For the past 3 months, my family has been the target of a systematic campaign of harassment by this board. We have received 11 violation notices, totaling over $900 in fines. They were for infractions as trivial as a coiled garden hose and my son's bicycle." He paused, letting the words sink in. "At first, I thought it was personal, a retaliation for me questioning the board's questionable financial decisions." He glanced at Henderson, whose face had tightened into a hard knot. "But I was wrong. It wasn't just about me." He turned to the crowd. "It was about the Chen family, who were fined for planting vegetables native to their culture in their own backyard." In the third row, Mr. Chen stood up. "He called our garden an eyesore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It was about the Garcia family," Marcus continued, "who were fined for celebrating their son's high school graduation." Mrs. Garcia stood. "He said our music was a public disturbance," she declared, her eyes flashing with anger. One by one they stood, the young couple with the rainbow flag, the single mother fined for her child's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. A dozen voices, a dozen stories of petty tyranny, all weaving together into a damning portrait of a man who used his power to bully and intimidate anyone he deemed different or defiant. The room was buzzing now, the air thick with rebellion. Henderson was white as a sheet, his knuckles a ghostly white where he gripped the edge of the table. Then Mrs. Gable rose, a file of her own in her hand. And while Mr. Henderson was so busy policing our gardens and our celebrations, he seems to have forgotten a few rules himself. She placed a photograph on the overhead projector. It showed Henderson's massive, unapproved fence. This fence is in clear violation of Article V, but more importantly, let's talk about that sidewalk contract he was so eager to protect. She projected another document, a business registration for Precision Paving. This company is owned by a Mr. Franklin Miller. According to public records, Mr. Miller is also the brother of Susan Henderson. She looked directly at the board president. "Your wife's brother, isn't that right, Jim?" A collective gasp swept the room. It was out. The cronyism, the corruption, laid bare for everyone to see. Henderson slammed his hand on the table. "This is an outrage. These are baseless accusations." "Are they?" Marcus's voice cut through the chaos like a razor. He held up his folder. "Because this folder doesn't contain accusations. It contains evidence." He walked toward the board table, the crowd parting for him like water. "This is a formal complaint which will be filed with the State Attorney General's office tomorrow morning. It details a pattern of discriminatory housing practices, financial misconduct, and abuse of authority by this board and its president." He let the folder drop onto the table in front of Henderson. The sound echoed in the stunned silence. "It includes copies of every fraudulent violation notice you sent. It includes a financial audit exposing the inflated bid from your brother-in-law's shell company. And it includes signed affidavits from 27 families in this neighborhood detailing your targeted harassment." He stood back, his gaze sweeping over the board. "The bylaws you love so much, Mr. Henderson, also give us a remedy. Article Roman 11, Section 2. A recall." He turned to the community. "I am making a motion to recall every member of this board, effective immediately. All in favor?" It started with one hand, then another, then a forest of them. The room was a sea of raised hands, a unified wave of defiance that was about to wash away the years of rot. Henderson stared, his mouth agape. The smug smirk was gone, replaced by the slack-jawed shock of a king who had just watched his castle crumble to dust. The power he had wielded with such arrogance had vanished, evaporated in the face of a community that had finally found its voice. He looked at Marcus, at the quiet architect who had refused to be broken, and for the first time he saw him not as a problem to be managed, but as the man who had just taken everything from him. The vote was a formality. He was already finished. The aftermath was quiet but profound. A new board was elected, a true reflection of the community it served. Marcus, Mrs. Gable, Mr. Chen, and 2 other residents who had stood up at the meeting. Their first order of business was to void the contract with Precision Paving. Their second was to hire one of the firms Marcus had originally proposed. The work on the sidewalks began a month later. The new crew was efficient, professional, and their work was impeccable. They didn't just patch the old cracks. They tore out the failing concrete and poured new, smooth foundations. One cool autumn afternoon, Marcus stood on his porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He watched Leo ride his red bicycle down the street, his wheels gliding effortlessly over the newly paved sidewalk. There were no bumps, no fractures, no obstacles in his way. The ride was smooth. Maya came out and stood beside him, wrapping an arm around his waist. She followed his gaze to their son, a small, joyful figure pedaling into the future. "You did it," she said softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You fixed it." Marcus watched Leo disappear around the bend, his laughter echoing in the quiet air. He thought of the cracked pavement that had started it all, a symbol of the brokenness he refused to accept. He had fought back not with brute force, but with precision, with evidence, with a community united by a shared sense of dignity. He hadn't just fixed a sidewalk. He had mended a promise.